It's the kind of story that begins with betrayal, one that you'd never expect from someone you trusted most. Imagine a day meant to be the happiest of your life, only to have it turn into the breaking point of a relationship you thought was unshakable. That's exactly what happened to me on my wedding day. My brother, the one person I always thought would stand by me, chose that moment to humiliate me in front of everyone. But that wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. What followed was a chain of events that forced me to make a choice that would change everything. The family business, built by our parents, was on the line, and my brother's reckless actions were about to cost him everything. In the end, I didn't just take back control of the company. I took back my dignity, my respect, and my future. This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and the ultimate price of standing up for yourself when no one else will. If you're ready to hear how it all unfolded, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's dive into it. It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life, the culmination of months of planning, hope, and joy. My wedding day had arrived, and it was supposed to be a celebration of love, the coming together of two families, and the beginning of a new chapter. From the moment I stepped into my wedding suit, the energy around me was electric. The air was thick with excitement and love. Family, friends, and all those who had been part of my journey had gathered to witness the bond between me and my soon-to-be wife, Sophie. I had been dreaming about this day for years. The dress rehearsals, the flower arrangements, the music. We had thought of every detail. The old church we chose for the ceremony was filled with memories, as my parents had gotten married there too. Everything was aligned perfectly. But, just as the vows were about to be exchanged, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. It was as if someone had thrown a bucket of ice water on the warm and joyful atmosphere. My brother, Richard, the one I had always considered my closest ally, the one who had been my right-hand man in everything, decided to take that moment to publicly humiliate me. Standing there, in front of everyone, he began to make sarcastic remarks about my choice of venue, questioning Sophie's background, and even suggesting that I was making a huge mistake. The words stung more than I could ever imagine. His tone was sharp and biting, making it clear that he was intentionally trying to undermine me in front of all our guests. At first, I thought I had misheard him. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. I thought, maybe this is a joke. Maybe it's just Richard being Richard, always the troublemaker, always the one to stir the pot. But as the seconds ticked by, and I saw the expressions on the faces of our family and friends, I realized this was no joke. He was serious. I looked at Sophie, who stood next to me, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Her smile faded as she looked from me to Richard, and I could feel her pain. This was supposed to be the happiest moment of our lives, and now it felt like it was crumbling right before my eyes. The guests awkwardly shifted in their seats, unsure of how to respond. They were caught in the crossfire of a family feud that had no place at a wedding. I turned to Richard, trying to hold back my emotions, but the anger was bubbling inside me. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, my voice barely audible, but firm. "Why are you doing this?" His eyes briefly flickered with hesitation, but he quickly recovered, as if readying himself for an attack. "Look, I just don't think this is right. This marriage, it's not the way it should be. You're making a mistake, and deep down, you know it." The words cut deeper than I could have ever anticipated. The man who I had once trusted with everything, the one who had been there for me through thick and thin, was now telling me that my choice to marry Sophie was a mistake. My mind raced as I tried to hold it together, but it felt like the walls were closing in around me, and then it hit me. This wasn't just about Sophie or the wedding. This was about something far deeper. This was about the family business. Richard had always been a part of the business, and for years we had worked side by side to grow it. But over time, I began to notice the cracks, his arrogance, his disregard for my opinion, and his sense of entitlement. He began to act as if the business was solely his, as if I was just a figurehead. He had taken more and more control, while I had quietly stepped back, not wanting to rock the boat. But in that moment, as he stood there, publicly degrading me, I realized that it wasn't just Sophie he was disrespecting, it was me. He was trying to tear me down, because in his mind, I was no longer useful, I was a liability. The truth was, I had sacrificed so much for the family business, working late hours, making financial sacrifices, and always putting the company's interests ahead of my own. But Richard had never respected that. He'd always expected everything to be handed to him on a silver platter, while I had worked tirelessly, quietly building the foundation for what we had. And now, at my wedding, the one day I had waited for my entire life, he was trying to make me feel small. That moment, that single act of public humiliation, marked a turning point for me. It was as if a switch had been flipped. In a split second I realized that everything I had worked for, everything I had given up, had been taken for granted. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I smiled, although it didn't reach my eyes, and I walked away from the altar. I didn't look back. As the guests stared in stunned silence, I stepped outside, my mind racing, my heart heavy. The plan was already forming in my head. This would be the end of the old me, the brother who always sacrificed, who always took the back seat. It was time to take control, not just of my wedding day, but of the family business. It was time for me to show Richard and everyone else who had taken me for granted that I was no longer playing by their rules. The family business had always been at the heart of everything I did. It was the legacy passed down from our parents, a dream they built from the ground up. I grew up watching my father pour his blood, sweat and tears into it, making sacrifices that few would ever understand. It wasn't just a business, it was a part of our identity, our family's pride. To me, it was sacred. To Richard, it was something to be taken for granted. From a young age, I knew the business would eventually become our responsibility. My father had always made it clear, when I'm gone, it's yours. I took that promise seriously. I learned the ropes early, sitting in the office after school, shadowing my father as he negotiated deals and solved problems. I had a natural understanding of the intricacies of the business, from the financials to the operations, and I always took pride in my contribution. Richard, on the other hand, was different. He had a certain charm that won people over easily. He was always the life of the party, the one who could schmooze with clients and make things happen in a way that felt effortless. As a child, I was always the quieter one, the one who focused on the details while Richard charmed the world. But that worked for us, at least for a time. He was the face of the business, and I was the backbone, making sure everything functioned smoothly behind the scenes. Together, we made a great team, or so I thought. Over the years, however, I began to notice the subtle shift. Richard's success seemed to be built on charm alone, without the hard work that I had put into the business. His attitude began to change. What once was an equal partnership turned into something far more one-sided. He began making decisions without consulting me, acting as if he was the sole owner of the business. He treated the company like it was a personal empire, one that he believed was his birthright, while I quietly stood by, unsure of how to confront the growing tension. But the tension didn't stop there. It seeped into our relationship. The brother I had once trusted and looked up to was becoming someone I no longer recognized. It wasn't just the business anymore. It was everything. The more I gave, the more he took, and the more I realized that my sacrifices were never truly appreciated. It wasn't just about the late nights or the long hours. It was the constant feeling that my hard work was invisible to him. I remember one particular moment that stuck with me. It was right after we had secured a major deal that was supposed to set the business up for years to come. I had worked tirelessly for months on the logistics, handling the negotiations, working out the details, and securing the financing. It was a massive win for the business, and I was proud of what we had accomplished. But Richard took all the credit. Not a word about my role, not a single acknowledgement of the work I had put in. In fact, he barely mentioned me at all. When I confronted him about it, he simply shrugged it off, saying, "It doesn't matter. What matters is that the deal's done." It was in moments like these that I realized Richard had come to see the business not as something we had built together, but as something that belonged to him. And I was just a pawn in his game. He had become entitled, treating me like an accessory rather than an equal. Every time I tried to voice my concerns, he brushed me off, telling me to stop being dramatic or accusing me of overthinking things. It was like he had forgotten the foundation of the business, the sacrifices, the late nights, and the financial struggles that had built it into what it was today. He had lost sight of the values that had made the business successful, and with it, he had lost respect for the very people who had helped him get there. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. The business wasn't just mine. It was a symbol of everything I had done for our family. But it had become something Richard thought he could control on his own. And that was something I could no longer tolerate. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the realization that I had allowed myself to be sidelined for far too long. I had given everything to this business, to this family, and now it was time to take it back. In that moment, I understood that the family business wasn't just a legacy, it was a battleground. And if I was going to reclaim my place, I had to be prepared to fight. The business wasn't just my inheritance. It was my dignity, my respect, and my future. Richard had underestimated me, thinking he could take control without facing the consequences. But I knew that I couldn't let him get away with it any longer. The time for action had come. It was in the silence after the wedding that I truly began to feel the weight of what had happened. As I drove away from the church, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind replayed Richard's words over and over again. "You're making a mistake." He had said it with such conviction, as though he held the truth in his hands. I had always assumed that the bond we shared, the years of trust and mutual support, would hold strong through any challenge. But in that moment, I realized that Richard had become a stranger to me, someone who no longer valued what we had built together. I had always been the one to take the back seat. I was the responsible one, the one who took care of the details, worked late hours, and kept everything running smoothly behind the scenes. Richard, on the other hand, was the face of the business, the one who schmoozed clients, made the big deals, and enjoyed the accolades. We worked well together, or so I thought. I believed that the business we built was a partnership, a shared dream. But as I sat in my truck, parked in front of the house I had built, I realized that my dream had become a figment of my imagination, As I stared out into the empty driveway, a sense of finality washed over me. I thought about the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the financial strain, the personal sacrifices I had made to support the business, all for a family that seemed to take everything for granted. And now Richard had humiliated me in front of everyone, as though I was nothing more than an afterthought. He had taken it too far this time. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just sweep it under the rug like I had so many times before. This time the anger I felt was different. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about everything. The business, the years of my life I had spent in the shadows, watching as Richard took control without ever truly appreciating my contributions. The injustice of it all settled deep within me, and in that moment, I knew I had to act. It wasn't just about revenge, though. It was about reclaiming what was mine, what was rightfully mine. The business, the family legacy, I had earned it. It was a truth I had ignored for far too long, but now it burned inside me with an intensity I couldn't ignore. I was done playing the role of the dutiful son, the silent partner. I was done letting Richard walk all over me, as if I was a mere spectator in the very thing I had worked so hard to build. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how long I had been suppressing my own voice, my own desires, all in the name of family loyalty. For years I had been the silent partner, the one who made all the sacrifices, the one who didn't make waves. But in the process, I had lost myself. And that wasn't something I was willing to continue. I had spent so much time building a future for others, but when it came to myself, I had nothing to show for it. I had allowed Richard to dictate everything, and I had silently accepted his dominance. It was time for that to end. I began to see the business in a new light. It wasn't just a company. It was my future, my legacy, my chance to prove that I wasn't just the supporting character in someone else's story. I had worked too hard to let it slip through my fingers. I wasn't going to let Richard's arrogance and entitlement steal it from me, just like he had stolen my dignity. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Richard was not going to give up control without a fight, but I was ready. I had been fighting this battle quietly for years, but now it was time to fight back. As the realization settled in, I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't felt in years. The decision was made. I wasn't just going to sit back and take it anymore. I was going to take back what was mine, and I was going to do it on my terms. This wasn't about punishing Richard. It was about taking control of my life, my future, and my business. It was about reclaiming my respect. The more I thought about the steps I needed to take, the clearer the plan became. I didn't need to shout or make a scene. What I needed was strategy, precision, and a calm determination to make my move. I would go through the legal routes, review the company's financials, and gather evidence of Richard's mismanagement. I didn't need to rush into this. I would take my time and plan every step carefully. Richard might have thought he could control the business with his charm and entitlement, but I knew the real power lay in the work I had put in, the sacrifices I had made, and the respect I had earned. It was time to take back control. It was time to show Richard, and everyone else, that the business was mine, not because I was his brother, but because I had earned it. And when the time came, I would make sure he knew exactly what it felt like to be shut out of something you thought you controlled. The first step toward taking back control of the family business was not as dramatic as I had envisioned. It wasn't about making grand speeches or confronting Richard in front of the whole family. No, It was about quiet precision, and that's exactly what I had planned. I needed to gather evidence, solid, irrefutable proof that I was the one who had built this business, and Richard was the one who had taken it for granted. I started by revisiting the company's financial records. I had always kept track of the books, ensuring that everything was in order, but over the years Richard had gradually taken on more of the responsibilities. His arrogance had convinced him that he was the true face of the business, and for too long I had allowed him to operate without scrutiny. But now, I needed to know exactly where the money was going, how it was being spent, and what decisions had been made without my input. As I sat at my desk, poring over the spreadsheets, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. There it was, in black and white. The company's bank account had been bled dry over the past few years. Richard had approved extravagant expenses, things that were completely unnecessary, luxury trips, lavish office upgrades, and perks that benefited him and his inner circle, while the business itself was struggling to stay afloat. It was as if he had forgotten the very principles that had built this business. I had sacrificed so much to keep things running smoothly, and now Richard was squandering it all. But it wasn't just about money, it was about control. Richard had made decisions without consulting me, huge, life-altering decisions that I should have been a part of. I uncovered contracts he had signed without my signature, new business ventures he had launched without discussing them with me, and worst of all, decisions that were damaging to the company in the long run. It was clear to me now, Richard didn't care about the legacy or the business. He cared about his own success, and if the business had to suffer for that, then so be it. I felt the anger rising again, but this time it wasn't just rage, it was resolve. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I had all the evidence I needed. The next step was to confront Richard, but I knew that confrontation wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about setting the record straight with him, it was about taking back the business, and I needed to act quickly and strategically. I reached out to a few key people who had been with the business from the beginning, loyal employees and trusted advisors. I could sense their unease when I contacted them. They had seen the way Richard had taken over, pushing everyone else aside, but no one had the courage to speak up. They all respected me, but it had been so long since I had made my voice heard that they weren't sure what to expect. I assured them that I wasn't interested in tearing the business down. I wanted to rebuild it. With their support, I began gathering the legal and financial documents I would need to reclaim control. I couldn't do this alone. The plan began to take shape. I would first take control of the company's assets, secure the accounts, ensure that no further damage could be done. I would then initiate a board meeting where I would present all the evidence of Richard's mismanagement and poor decisions. I knew this would be a battle, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't the quiet, passive brother who just accepted everything. I was the one who had built this business, and now I was going to fight for it. But before I made my move, I needed to confront Richard directly. It was time for him to understand the consequences of his actions. I called him and asked him to meet me at the office. I could hear the hesitation in his voice when he agreed, and for a moment I wondered if he was starting to realize what was coming. But I pushed that thought aside. I knew I had to stay focused. This wasn't about emotions, it was about reclaiming what was mine. The day of the meeting, I arrived early. I had everything prepared. Financial records, contracts, emails, and documents that clearly showed how Richard had mismanaged the company. I had everything laid out on the table in front of me, proof that I had been right all along, and that the time for me to step back into the role I was meant to have had finally come. When Richard walked into the office, he was still wearing that smug smile, the same one I had seen countless times over the years. But today, it didn't reach his eyes. I watched him as he sat across from me, trying to size up the situation, but I wasn't about to let him manipulate the conversation this time. I opened the folder, and without a word, I slid the documents in front of him. His face paled as he scanned the papers. "What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly cold. "This is the evidence of everything you've done, the waste, the mismanagement, the disregard for the legacy we built. It's over, Richard. I'm taking control of the business." His eyes flashed with anger, but I wasn't intimidated. The truth was on my side. It was time for Richard to understand that I wasn't going to back down any longer. I had made my decision. I wasn't just fighting for the business. I was fighting for my dignity, my respect, and my future. The battle had begun. The day I walked into the office to confront Richard, I knew it was only the beginning. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how far Richard would go to hold on to the control he had taken from me. He was used to running things his way, and he wasn't about to let me waltz in and take it all back without a fight. But I was prepared. I had the facts, the evidence, and the support of key people who were tired of seeing the company fall apart because of one man's ego. After the meeting where I presented all the evidence of Richard's mismanagement, I thought I had made my point. The papers were undeniable, the truth was clear, and for a brief moment, I thought Richard might see reason. But instead of backing down, he did what he always did. He fought back with manipulation and arrogance. He refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, choosing instead to deny everything, even as the evidence piled up in front of him. "This is just a smear campaign," he muttered, almost dismissively, as if the consequences of his actions were nothing more than a misunderstanding. I could see his anger building, but I remained calm, keeping my voice steady. "Richard, this isn't just a misunderstanding. This is your business falling apart because you couldn't manage it properly. And I'm done sitting by and watching you destroy everything we've worked for." Richard leaned back in his chair, the smug look that I had come to loathe creeping back across his face. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? You don't have what it takes to run this business. You never have." Those words, that sense of entitlement, were like a slap in the face. Richard had been running the company into the ground for years, treating everyone, including me, as disposable. But it wasn't about just the business anymore. It was about respect. And that was something Richard had stripped away over the years. The more I looked at him, the more I realized that he had no idea who I had become. I wasn't the younger brother who had always deferred to him. I was someone who had earned every right to take control and run this business. "Watch me," I said, my voice unwavering. "You've made your decisions. Now it's time for me to make mine." The battle lines had been drawn, but what I hadn't expected was how quickly things would escalate. Richard, in his arrogance, underestimated how far I was willing to go. Within days, I began taking action. I moved to secure the company's assets. I made sure that the accounts were in order, that the financial decisions were documented, and that Richard's influence was officially minimized. It wasn't long before I reached out to the board of directors, calling an emergency meeting to address the growing concerns about the business's future under Richard's leadership. But Richard wasn't going to let go of the reins so easily. He had spent years building a network of loyal followers who believed in his vision, or perhaps more accurately, his illusion of success. These people, many of whom had been with the company for years, were now questioning their loyalty. Richard had used his charm to secure their support, but now, as the truth came to light, He lashed out, trying to rally his team against me, accusing me of trying to undermine him, of betraying the family. At the board meeting, Richard attempted to make his case, painting me as the villain, an opportunistic brother who was trying to steal everything from him. But what he didn't realize was that I wasn't alone in this fight. Slowly but surely, members of the board began to turn against him. They had seen the signs, the financial instability, and the tension that had been building for years. The moment of reckoning had arrived. I had taken control of the narrative. I wasn't just fighting for the business, I was fighting for the truth. I began speaking with the press, making sure the story of the family's division, Richard's mismanagement, and my efforts to save the company were told. What Richard didn't realize was that his carefully constructed public image was crumbling. The media, which had once portrayed him as the golden boy of the business world, began to question his credibility. The tipping point came when an article was published in a local business magazine. It wasn't a simple recount of the family dispute. It was a sharp exposé detailing Richard's reckless decisions and the financial strain he had caused the business. The story went viral, spreading through local news outlets and social media. Richard's reputation, built on charm and deceit, was now in freefall. His own connections turned their backs on him, and his loyal supporters began to question their loyalty. It wasn't long before the pressure became too much. Richard tried to salvage his position, making phone calls to his network, trying to spin the story in his favor, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The board, seeing the writing on the wall, finally voted to remove Richard from his position as CEO, offering him a severance package in exchange for his departure. As I stood there looking at Richard's shocked face, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about destroying him. It was about rebuilding what he had torn apart. I had taken back the business, but more importantly, I had taken back my life, my self-respect, and my dignity. The battle was over, but the journey had just begun. I had learned that sometimes taking back control means making hard decisions, facing the truth, and not backing down in the face of resistance. The day the board voted to remove Richard from his position as CEO felt like a victory. After all the years of sacrifice, manipulation, and emotional turmoil, it was finally over. I had taken control of the family business, the company that I had helped build from the ground up, the company that had been my pride and my responsibility. The battle for the business had been intense, but in the end, the truth had won. However, victory wasn't as sweet as I had imagined. As I sat alone in the office after the meeting, the weight of the decision began to settle in. Richard was out, yes, but the consequences of the fight, the fallout from the family, and the challenges ahead began to loom large. The business was mine again, but at what cost? First, there was the loss of my brother. The emotional toll of what I had just done hit me harder than I had anticipated. For years, Richard had been my closest family member, my confidant, the one person I thought I could trust above all else. We had shared so much, our childhood, our ambitions, our dreams of growing the family business together. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had fallen apart. Richard's arrogance, his disregard for the sacrifices I had made, and his growing sense of entitlement had driven a wedge between us. And in the end, I had to make the painful decision to sever that bond. I couldn't escape the guilt that weighed heavily on my chest. In some ways, I felt as though I had betrayed him, even though he had given me no choice. Richard wasn't just a business partner, he was my brother. The tension that had built up over the years hadn't been resolved by his removal from the company. It had only deepened. The man who had once been my closest ally was now a stranger, someone I had to confront in a way I never imagined. It was hard not to wonder if there was another way I could have done things, a way to preserve the family bond while still taking back control. But in my heart, I knew there wasn't. The company, despite its successes, was in a fragile state. Although I had reclaimed it, there was still so much to repair. Richard had left behind a trail of poor decisions, from reckless investments to employees who had been left in limbo, uncertain of their future. Many of the contracts he signed were questionable, and the company's financials were far from pristine. I had to act quickly to stabilize things, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of the employees who depended on the company's success. They deserved a leader who cared about their future and the legacy we had built. I immediately started to make changes, beginning with securing the company's financial future. I cut unnecessary expenses, renegotiated contracts, and implemented tighter financial controls to prevent any future mismanagement. It was a slow process, and there were times when I doubted whether I could turn things around. But the more I worked, the clearer it became. This business was mine to save. I had the passion, the experience, and the drive to make it succeed again. But the personal consequences were harder to deal with. Richard's departure left a rift in the family that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. My parents were devastated by the fallout, torn between their love for their sons and the business that had been their life's work. They had always dreamed of seeing Richard and me working side by side, continuing the family legacy. Now they were left to pick up the pieces of what had once been a close-knit family. The guilt I felt over their pain was almost unbearable. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this battle, but there was no way around it. The rest of the family reacted in varying degrees of support or disappointment. Some relatives, including a few cousins who had always been loyal to me, expressed their admiration for my courage in taking a stand. They understood why I had done what I did, even if they didn't entirely agree with the method. But others, particularly some of Richard's close friends and allies, were furious. They viewed my actions as an unforgivable betrayal, and their anger toward me was palpable. I could see it in the way they looked at me at family gatherings, in the coldness in their voices when they spoke. The business had caused a rift, not only between Richard and me, but between the entire family. The media too played a role in the aftermath. The story of the family business dispute had made headlines, and although I had taken control, the public perception was still in flux. Some praised me for taking a stand and restoring integrity to the company, while others criticized me for airing the family's dirty laundry in public. There were still questions about how Richard's fall from grace would affect the business in the long term. Would the company be able to recover from the damage, or had the public spat torn apart the trust that had once been integral to its success? As I sat at my desk, the weight of all these responsibilities settled on my shoulders. I had won the battle for the business, but the war for my peace of mind was just beginning. I was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding not only the company, but also the relationships I had lost along the way. The truth was, taking back the business hadn't been the end of the journey, it had only marked the beginning of a much longer, more difficult road. But in that moment, as I looked out over the office where it had all begun, I knew one thing for certain: I had made the right decision. The business was mine, and I would fight for it every day. More importantly, I had learned a crucial lesson. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means facing the consequences and moving forward, no matter how painful it may be. As I sat back in the leather chair in my office, looking at the company that was now mine to lead, I couldn't help but reflect on the tumultuous journey that had brought me here. The battle for control of the family business had been intense, emotional, and at times heartbreaking. But as I glanced around the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. The fight was over, and for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. The business, while still in the early stages of recovery, was starting to show signs of life again. Richard's removal had been the catalyst for change, but now the work truly began. The financials were back on track. Employees were beginning to trust the leadership again, and I had made it clear to everyone that I wasn't going to let the company fall into the hands of greed or mismanagement. This business was a part of me, and I was going to protect it, no matter what. But it wasn't just the business that needed rebuilding, it was my life. The cost of taking control had been high. I had lost my brother, and with him, much of the relationship we had once shared. The family bond that had been forged over decades of shared experience had been shattered in a single moment of betrayal. And while the company was thriving, the emotional toll of the past months weighed heavily on me. I thought often about what had led to this point. For years I had sacrificed my own desires and dreams to keep the peace, to ensure the business ran smoothly, and to put family first. But in the process, I had lost sight of my own worth. I had allowed Richard to take the reins because, for a time, it felt easier. I didn't want to rock the boat, didn't want to create tension, but in doing so, I had sacrificed my own happiness, my own future, and my self-respect. Taking back the business had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it had also been the most freeing. The path ahead wasn't going to be without its challenges. Rebuilding trust within the family was a slow and painful process. My parents, though they supported me, were deeply hurt by the rift that had formed between Richard and me. They had always dreamed of seeing both their sons work side by side, continuing the family legacy together. But that dream had been shattered, and there was no way to fix it, at least not any time soon. I had to learn to accept the consequences of my actions. I knew that not everyone would understand why I had made the choices I had. Some family members still sided with Richard, unwilling to see the truth of his actions, and even though the business was secure under my leadership, I knew that I would always carry the weight of what I had lost. The loss of trust, the loss of family, and the loss of what could have been if things had turned out differently. But despite these challenges, I found myself growing stronger every day. I began to understand that reclaiming the business wasn't just about power or control, it was about taking ownership of my own life. For years I had been living in the shadow of my brother, my own dreams and desires eclipsed by his charisma and ambition. But now I was standing in the light. I had built something from the ground up, and I wasn't going to let it slip away again. The lessons I learned during this journey were not just about business, they were about self-worth, respect, and the importance of standing up for yourself, even when it's the hardest thing you've ever done. It was about understanding that family isn't just about blood, it's about trust, mutual respect, and support. And if those things are missing, sometimes you have to walk away from relationships that aren't healthy, no matter how much it hurts. I knew that moving forward, I would have to rebuild the relationships that mattered. It wouldn't be easy, and I wasn't sure it would ever be the same, but I was willing to try. For the first time in years, I was free to make decisions based on what was right for me, not just what was expected of me. As I looked out of my office window, watching the sun begin to set over the city, I realized something important. Taking control of the business had been the right decision, but it was only the beginning of my journey. The real work, both professionally and personally, was just starting. I had learned how to fight for what was mine, how to reclaim my place in the world, and most importantly, how to move forward without looking back. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to walk it, one step at a time. I had reclaimed my legacy, my self-respect, and my future, and no one could take that from me. The business was mine again, and so was my life. It was time to build something new, something stronger, something more meaningful. As I turned off the lights in my office and stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt the weight of the past months lift off my shoulders. There was a new beginning on the horizon, and I was ready to embrace it. And that's the story of how I took back control and reclaimed my future. It wasn't easy, but sometimes standing up for yourself is the hardest and most rewarding thing you can do. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more.